Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. Before we get started with the show, we wanted to draw your attention to our crowdfunding page on Patreon. If you've been enjoying the podcast, please consider supporting us there.
If you contribute to our crowdfunder, you can receive a great selection of rewards, notably sheaves of successful magazine pictures from myself, Rachel, and former co-hosts and friends of the show.
Thanks very much to Jenny Smith-Wilson for her contribution this month.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Rachel and myself spoke with the author Geoff Dyer.
We spoke to Geoff about his early life and his entry into writing, about fiction versus non-fiction, and about the economics of his writing life.
This is another episode that we recorded remotely during lockdown, so please forgive us for any problems with the audio, but it's otherwise a great episode and we really hope you enjoy it. So, Geoff, really good to have you on Always Take Notes and appreciate your patience with recording this remotely. I wanted to start by talking a bit about your early life, growing up with your, fair to say, sort of fairly working class background, but then getting to Oxford. And I was reading a Guardian interview with you saying that after you graduated, you were living on the dole in Brixton, and this was kind of a difficult thing for your parents to understand. And I was wondering how, did that kind of very traditional like exam escalator that you referred to there, how did that fit with you wanting to be a writer?
Yeah, well, thank you. God, what a big question here. You're going to have to expand this episode. We've got at least 24 hours to cover all of this socio-economic history. But you've summarised my situation. But I always feel that there's a kind of a warning light, an oxymoron warning light goes off with this combination of the factor of working class background, but I grew up in Cheltenham, which people think of as being such an archetypal, rather posh Regency town. But yeah, of course, there is a working class there, as there is everywhere. I guess I should also add I was born in 1958, so in many ways, I mean, the society was geared to make sure there was a constant supply of boys like me, more boys I would say than girls, who would take the 11 plus, go to grammar school, and from grammar school on to university, all this kind of stuff. And yeah, so what I really need to emphasise more than anything is that I should not take any personal credit for this. There was absolutely no sense of pulling myself up by my own bootstraps. It was a completely passive process, and there was a long tradition of people from my grammar school going to Oxford, and I did that, and it was great. And I think what happened is that weirdly I sort of ended up taking the values of literature, which is that it's important. It's not important to have lots of money. It's all about the sort of quality of life in the largest sense. And I so liked studying literature at university. It seemed that I rather liked the idea of spending more time reading. So it made total sense to sign on the dole after that. And conveniently, it was a period of mass unemployment. So it was a completely respectable thing to do. And it suited me rather well, but it did come as a source of great surprise to my parents, who assumed that after Oxford I might go on to a more respectable life in their terms. Of course, they were unaware that this was this was a sign of my having ascended to a version of the middle class.
And I think you said your first published piece was book review. What were some of the other things you were writing, and how did you go about starting a career in writing?
Oh, yeah. Oh, great. How nice that we can start falling out at this early stage. I always like it when there's a slightly sort of adversarial quality. So it's never been a career in writing for me. I mean, if it was regarded as a career, then it's been sort of semi-disastrous, really. This is my writing life has not been the way you go about building a career. And also, I guess it's something else that I would emphasise I mean, I like the idea of writing, of course, but I mean, in a real sense, I mean, writing it's something that's left for you when other options haven't worked out. So really, it was the fact that there were so few jobs available in the early 1980s meant that, well, nothing else was available in a way that, in a different time it might have been possible to get on in TV or something else, or even academia or whatever. So writing was something I just kind of drifted into. But you're absolutely right. The first thing I wrote was a book review, and that grew out very naturally from the life that I've just described at university, where, of course, one is reading a lot. And then all that was happening really is that, the Oxford English course stopped with, I think the most recent person we did was Samuel Beckett. And after that, I mean, well, two things happened. One, my reading became more international, so that all the Russians to read, having done English. And also I was getting more and more up to date, to the extent that I was getting buying paperbacks soon after they were published. And then I was actually getting impatient for the hardbacks, and it made sort of sense at that point. I mean, how do you get even more up to date? Well, you get hold of books not after they're published, but before they're published. And I was. It was just a question of becoming more and more up to date. And so I gradually became a writer, and writing about books was the way in which that process began.
What was London in the 1980s kind of like for someone making their way in those steps? I mean, I think Ian McEwan talk about his immediate post-university experience and saying, he could get like a big flat, it wasn't that expensive. The things that kind of people today talk about, like the prohibitive cost of London as a place to pursue a creative career. But at the same time, I suppose Brixton there'd been riots and things like, without taking off any nostalgic goggles as much as possible. Do you think it was a good time to be making your way?
What a great question, Simon, and what a almost impossible one to answer, because it's so difficult to sort of see it for what it really was. I think there's several things going on here. I mean, first of all, it was a time in the 1980s when the exact opposite of what it's been for the last several years, where every time you go to buy The Guardian now in the shops, if you ever do, it's gone up another 10p and it's lost another 4 pages. In the 1980s, there were just more and more the newspapers were getting thicker and thicker with more and more cultural, leisure, or let's say non-news supplements. So there were more and more opportunities to write about lifestyle and culture and books, all this kind of stuff. And I think also that coincided with some sort of de-unionization. So it was possible to write it was getting easier to write for newspapers and magazines without going down the straightforward cub reporter kind of route. So I think that's just on the employment aspect of things, that's really important. That coincided also with the fact that the safety net of the welfare state was in very robust condition. So while it wasn't easy to earn a lot of money, you didn't need a lot of money because the rent could be paid on a flat by the state, and also London at that point was still so geared up for people living cheaply. It was, I feel very conscious that to use an inappropriate phrase, I bought into, as it were, the kind of fag end of the alternative sort of post-hippie thing of just, of living cheaply. And there was a whole, London was so set up for this. I keep thinking about just how cheap everything was. Cheap and sort of low quality as well. So although, Ian McEwan is 10 years older than me, so a different generation. But there was, life in Brixton looking back, or in London generally. I look back to it now and it seems in a way rather Soviet-like and rather sort of grim compared with the great sort of boom of the cappuccino years. But yeah, it was very, very conducive to living cheaply. I think.
Could you kind of sketch for us how you came to write your first book then, from those kind of early years and book reviews and writing about literature?
Yeah, well, again, everything just continued from that. So it was just such a great time of my life intellectually in the 1980s when I was living on the Dole in Brixton in a flat with nearly all graduates, quite a lot of them Oxford graduates. Really, it's just that now I teach here in America, and I'm teaching quite often these people doing MFAs, and they're in their mid-20s, and I'm always reminded what a great period that is in one's life, because one has done one has the brain has been formatted, as it were, and you know how to start finding stuff out, and it's a period typically of just great cultural. You're just really absorbing a lot of cultural stuff, and I remember very distinctly during this period of discovering a lot of new writers, one of whom was John Berger, who really opened up all sorts of possibilities of writing and new forms of books. And it made total sense. There was a complete boring logic to it that, having written a lot of book reviews, what might I do? Well, I'd end up writing a book about John Berger, this writer that I loved so much. And so I got a contract from Pluto Press with an advance of £1,000 to do exactly that. And I proceeded then to write this unbelievably boring book about John Berger, this great writer who in many ways I so failed to do justice to, because I don't know, in some ways I must have had some residual kind of craving for academic respectability. So effectively, while sort of living on the Dole in Brixton, I ended up writing some sort of rather poor quality PhD, really, just a very straightforward work of critical analysis. And so it grew. My first book, published in 1986, just about published in 1986, I should say, because right at the moment when I was meant to get the first copy of the book, Pluto went into receivership, setting a precedent for bad luck that has dogged my entire writing life. But yeah, that's how that first book came about, and it served a very useful purpose, I think, because almost as soon as I finally got a copy, when Pluto was sort of rehabilitated, I thought, oh my God, why did I do that? Why did I write a boring book when I could have written an interesting book? And thereafter, I like to think I've sort of dedicated myself to writing interesting books, interesting for the reader, and much more interesting and fun for me to write.
So you've pushed in a lot of your work against this distinction between fiction and non-fiction. Was that something that you were kind of aware of early on, or was that a path that just became more clear to you, that you wanted to break down some of those barriers?
Yeah, I think I was conscious of it, but what I certainly wasn't, I was not any kind of, I was no Johnny Rotten kind of figure. There was no, I had no desire to unleash anarchy in the world of UK publishing, or tear down the barricades separating fiction from non-fiction. I was never a revolutionary or it's not like I ever drew up a manifesto of intent or anything like that. It was a much gentler and personal thing. And the two things of reading and writing, as ever, went very much hand in hand. So my experience at university was entirely of reading, fiction, really, except for reading books about books. So the distinction was, I thought of literature as being, in prose, as being the novel. And then when I started reading people like John Berger and Roland Barthes, on the one hand, I became conscious of these other kind of books that I could read. And also, I became conscious of maybe a form of writing which would enable me to be a writer, because I was less than well equipped in all sorts of ways to write straightforward fiction. I mean, the most obvious one of which is that I've always struggled with plot creation. I mean, I know that there's more to writing fiction than plots, but I think that sense of a widening of formal possibility beyond the strict area of the novel was a really important, that really made things possible, and it was very, very liberating and encouraging for me, I think.
I like the Johnny Rotten reference, because I read one interview with you where they described your style as genre demolition, which sounds aggressive. In terms
Yes.
of blending reportage fiction, kind of other styles of writing, for But Beautiful in 1991, which is obviously a book about jazz, how do you go about researching and putting together a book like that?
Oh yeah, I mean, this is great, yeah, because it's funny that, I mean, we can come back to this notion of I was talking about the Berger book as being a kind of, kind of default PhD. I mean, it was the jazz book was, I would say, anything but researched. I mean, what was going on is that, it all ties in quite nicely. So in this shared slum that we lived in Brixton in the 1980s, I had a friend there who I knew from Oxford who had this great jazz collection, and he really got me into jazz, and we just had so many great evenings, when I heard Alabama by Coltrane for the first time, or Get It, or Wednesday Night Prayer Meeting by Mingus, and I listened to all this stuff, and I was so passionate about jazz and so wanting to learn more about it, but that desire never took the form, it seemed to me, of me researching it. I was just endlessly curious, and anyway, I went to New York. I got an advance from a publisher in Britain to do this book about jazz, and I suppose you could say that one of the things I was doing there was researching it. And yeah, I went to the Institute of Jazz Studies, but it never felt like research at all. It felt exactly like it did when I first got into that world of Dylan bootlegs when I was a student, and thereafter. It just felt like following up on this great enthusiasm. There was never any of the drudgery of that I associate with research, and there was never any of the systematic approach. It just felt like, when you're pursuing a hobby, it never feels like any kind of work. So it was just like that, really. And I guess the other crucial thing I need to emphasize is that this would be in about 1918. Yeah, this was exactly 1989 when I went to do this. So jazz was so thriving still in New York, and it was possible to see, to feel such a direct connect, to perceive such a direct connection between the people I was going to see play every night and the people that they had played with in the past, who I was writing about. These kind of figures like Charles Mingus and so forth. So I was learning about it and writing about it, and I mean, it would be an exaggeration to say I was living it, because of course I can't play a note of music. But yeah, It was part of being a jazz fan was a life I could lead. And I guess I'll just mention something else, because it seems so novel. So novel at the time, although it's something that people take for granted now. I was absolutely the beneficiary of this, really important technological breakthrough, the Walkman, so that we all take it for granted now. But if you maybe I don't, but it was so weird back then, the experience of walking around with headphones on and this music in your head. It was so different. And it meant for somebody like me that if I was writing about Thelonious Monk, I could walk up to the neighborhood where Monk lived and see everything that he had been seeing with this music absolutely in my head, which was so conducive to a kind of synesthesia whereby the music expressed itself in terms of what I was seeing and smelling, and what I was seeing and smelling was so sort of bleeding all the time into the music. So that was absolutely important. That way of doing things. It made life very, very easy, and it had been possible technologically only a few years before that, I think.
Could we talk about D.H. Lawrence? Did you, writing out of sheer rage, was your relationship with him a passion one? I mean, how would you compare your relationship and the process of writing that book on Lawrence with writing about jazz?
Oh yeah, very, very similar. I mean, and I think the motive for nearly all of the books has been pretty much the same. So with jazz, it was, God, why, what is it about this music, which I'd only discovered in my late 20s. With Lawrence, of course, it was very different because I discovered him at school. But I think on the one hand, I could say, yeah, Lawrence was a really important figure for me personally for all sorts of reasons, because I loved Sons and Lovers. And I had a photograph of him on my bedroom wall in a way that now somebody of my age might have a picture of whoever it is young people have pictures of now. So there was a very personal thing that I had, but as is so often in one's life, it turns out that this personal feeling I had was actually quite a common thing, in that it's not unusual at all for people to have an especially passionate personal relationship to D.H. Lawrence, to be somewhat in love with him. And I mean, I've made this distinction before, but I think it's a reasonable one. People can really, really love the books of E.M. Forster, but I think E.M. Forster, for all sorts of reasons, and I say this not to diminish at all his literary achievement, there's never going to be a cult of personality around Forster, but there always was about D.H. Lawrence, so that really you can see anybody who met Lawrence for more than 5 minutes ended up writing a memoir about the time they spent with him. And even those of us who came along later, still there was that kind of thing that you didn't just like Lawrence's books, you became some sort of apostle of Lawrence the man, which was useful because actually a lot of the writing in a lot of the books was just sort of it was either really, really bad or just sort of crazed nonsense. But yeah, it was such a passionate relationship, and in some ways Lawrence seemed to embody the something about the life of the writer which seemed extremely appealing. And so Out of Sheer Rage grew directly out of that. And there's two things. There's a lot of things going on there, but one of the serious things is to try to work out what it is about Lawrence's writing that remains fresh today. And it seemed to me that it's a bit of a struggle. It's a bit of a struggle to get through Women in Love now, and I was surprised to find that in many ways the bits of Lawrence's writing that remained most fresh and most alive were those that came lowest down the traditional hierarchy of genre.
So like the letters, right?
Yeah, that's right at the bottom, if you like. The letters were amazing. I also really liked the travel books and the essays, and so it seemed to me quite useful that this person who, of course, made such claims for the novel. The novel was the place where he was going to really, prove himself. Actually, in many ways, I think it turns out that the best of Lawrence is to be found outside the novel. And in that regard, he really did become our contemporary precisely because of that thing I touched on earlier, whereby my exposure to Berger and Barth and all these kind of people, that represented the beginning of what has since become a really important thing for me, which is that the arena in which you can make make your claim for literary greatness has now expanded so much beyond the novel. So in all sorts of ironic ways, Lawrence was a very much a sort of precursor of that.
Out of Show Age is partly about or wrestles with the difficulty of writing a biography of Lawrence. Is it fair to say that you find writing not difficult but certainly a challenge? I mean, in pieces you've discussed playfully your commitment to naps and to doing things badly, but how do you kind of go about the writing process?
Yeah, I mean, just to address the first part of your question, it was, I mean, really, the thing is that Lawrence has been very, very well served by biographers. So I think at the time I was writing my book, there was there were a lot of biographies. The Cambridge 3-volume biography of Lawrence was, I think, maybe volume 2 had just been published. So there was absolutely no need for another biography of Lawrence, it seemed to me, and no real need for the sober academic study that I claimed I was writing. So that was the sort of gag that I set up at the beginning, was just that, a gag. But I thought there was scope for a crazy, mad book about Lawrence. In fact, I mean, again, to go back to what I was saying about John Berger, there was something inappropriate about my writing a dull, straightforward academic book about this wildly original writer. And it seemed to me that it was really appropriate to write a crazy book about this crazy man and crazy writer, D.H. Lawrence. So that's what was going on there. And then in terms of what the sort of writing process is like for me, well, it's, all writers are always complaining about how difficult it is. But I mean, one thing that I started to sort of realize with those early books, like the jazz book and the book about the First World War and the Lawrence book, is that I think I started to realize there was no point me writing, spending any time writing the kind of book that somebody else could write. But I did have this kind of a kind of confidence, which is not unrelated to a kind of desperation, of feeling, okay, yeah, but there is some kind of book that can be written that only I could write. And, I was willing to take that wager that this thing, which is potentially self-indulgent, might actually be more worthwhile for people to read than the kind of book that anyone could write. And I always, with regard to that, I always come back to this wonderful line of Diane Arbus's when she says, about, there's other people doing this and that. She says, but I still feel I've got some slight corner on things, and that's been enough for me. The idea of having just some slightly unusual take on the subject matter, whatever that subject matter is.
With these real genre-bending books that you're writing, how does it work with your publishers? Like, do they know what they're going to get, and is what you deliver the relationship between the finished book and then how you might propose or sell it to your editors? How does that work?
Yeah, another great question. Thank you. I mean, this is something else that I've become so convinced of, that the typical and necessary process for non-fiction books is it can go like this, really. This is how it typically goes. You spend a lot of time drawing up a proposal. On the basis of that proposal, you then get an advance, you pocket the money, and then you go away and write the book, which dutifully fulfills the proposal, and that's it. several things. One, I've always been constitutionally incapable of doing any kind of proposal or synopsis because it's just been so boring. It's one of the reasons why I've never ever wanted to get involved in any kind of film work at all, because there you're always having to draw up for somebody else something which will grant you permission in the form of money to go on to the next stage. So I just hate writing any kind of proposal. I've never been an applier for grants or anything like that. So that's never worked for me. And the way things have happened, it's been twofold. Either I've just gone away and written the book, the non-fiction book, in the way that you do, typically when you write a novel. So, for example, the First World War book, I just wrote that, then handed it in to my agent who found a publisher for it. The alternative is that it's always been just done on some sort of a wing and a prayer. And in the case of the jazz book, I had a very good relationship with an editor. And really, I said to her, "Look, I promise. I can't do a proposal, but I promise this will be a book. I'll promise I'll write a good book about jazz." And I went away and did that. But yeah, doing a proposal and that's just so terrible for me. I can't bear it. And then I can bring this further up to date, whereby, the most spectacular instance of this I can think of is when I sold my novel Geoff in Venice, Death in Varanasi to a new publisher, Canongate in the UK, and then they were interested to learn what I was going to do next, and for all sorts of reasons, I said, "Oh well, I'll do a book about tennis," and I didn't need to do a proposal for this, for all sorts of reasons that we don't go into now. And I, very happily got the money for the novel that I'd finished and this new book. And then when it came to it, I had no desire to write it, and to cut a long story short, 18 months later, I handed in the book about tennis, which had changed somewhat. It had become a book about Andrei Tarkovsky. And what I'd done is, instead of writing the book about tennis, I'd summarised his film about Stalker. And this is something that I'd emphasise, really, that writers are often bitching about publishers and about how publishers are always wanting them to be more commercial and all this kind of stuff. But actually, my experience of publishers, they've been really surprisingly tolerant, given that they could justifiably have said, this isn't the book that was contracted, and even if we like this book about Tarkovsky, the truth is that Tarkovsky is a lot less commercially viable than tennis. But in both the UK and America, they happily, well, they with some surprise, they took delivery of and published this book about Tarkovsky. And I mean, I'm grateful to them, but yeah, it's absolutely right that they I make their lives more interesting, and this is what publishers should be. Anyone can publish a blockbuster novel by anybody, but it's exciting for them to get this kind of crazy unpublishable book and find a way to publish it. So I make their lives difficult and intensely rewarding, I like to think.
Presumably the kind of tolerance of filing a totally different book to what was commissioned is because your prose is acceptable and not unpublishable, and because you have a kind of established profile, and presumably you have followers that will read whatever you write.
I would offer just one small amendment to that idea that I can sort of get away with this because I have some sort of profile. I mean, yes, there is this common paradigm, if you like, the idea that you do your big commercial books, and then having achieved a certain reputation, you can then be free to do your less commercial totally free, your own more personal kind of work. Well, that's sort of true, except it turns out quite often that after a certain degree of success, your idea of what your personal passion project is has been so affected by commercial success that at the deepest personal level, that's what you want. And I say that not at all critically, but and the stakes for everybody would be higher. I mean, for me, actually, right from the start, I was only interested in doing my own thing, partly because it's not like even though we always sort of have this idea that it's quite easy or whatever, you can discover the formula for a bestseller and then do your own. I mean, I've never been able to get access to that software or that algorithm or whatever it is. And so my own case was rather different, really. I think one of the reasons that publishers have been sort of tolerant of what I've been up to is that the stakes have always been rather low. So, it hasn't really made much difference whether a novel that didn't sell very well was followed by a book about some other subject. So in some ways, I think there's been a in the midst of all this variegation of approach and subject matter, there's been a kind of consistency there, and it's the fact of having quite a low commercial profile has brought with it a certain kind of freedom of expectation on both my part and on the part of the publishers. So we could put this rather more crudely by saying the great freedom I had is that nobody really gave a toss what I was doing.
It's a tradition of the podcast that we ask everyone about money and how it interfaces with their writing life. How has that worked for you in terms of what fraction of your income has come from writing, and then how does the university piece, the teaching element, fit with that?
Oh yeah, that's a great question too. I mean, really, the thing is, I was such a beneficiary of this time of when I started. So it was I was always able to get by on very little money in London in the 1980s, and that didn't involve any kind of sacrifice at all. And then a couple of things happened. One, I got a part-time job reading 2 days a week in a publisher's office, and that was really, really great because I had the remaining five days to myself. And then there's always this idea that that what a shame that the novelist can't devote him or herself to writing. To writing these novels full time. Well, I never wanted to do that anyway, and I was always happy to be doing a combination of writing for magazines and newspapers and writing books. And one of the things about writing any kind of cultural journalism, of course, was that all sorts of stuff comes your way for free. So, being a book reviewer, I was getting free books, writing about music, free CDs, and if I reviewed concerts, there was also free concerts. So the whole lifestyle stuff was taken care of like that. And then, in addition, in normal life, going on holiday costs you money. Whereas with a bit of travel writing, I was finding that, wow, I was able to travel in much greater luxury than I would have done in normal life and get paid for it. So I think this thing of a low income allied to a really quite nice lifestyle was something I became accustomed to at an early stage. And in any case, the lowness of the income was so much more. It was more than compensated by all the time I had on my hands. And I would say with great pride, really, that I don't know how many taxis I've taken in London in my life. I'd say it's probably less than 50 or 60. And that certainly never, ever seemed like any kind of hardship at all. Okay, so there's that. And in Britain, it was, there's much more money in America. And then the other thing that's very different about it in America is that I became aware that nearly all writers in America had these teaching jobs, teaching creative writing. And of course, there's been a long tradition in Britain of scepticism about that, which has gradually been eaten away at because, of course, it's been provenly successful here in America. That nearly all writers have been through some kind of creative writing sort of program, something like that. And what happens in America is that when you're about 25, 26, and you've published your slim book of poems or a book of short stories, you get a teaching job then, with the consequence that the financial pressure is off you. Well, there's that. But for me, I felt that in Britain, I thought it was no bad thing to have this lash of economic necessity keeping me writing a lot. I just felt that was a good thing. And then I only came to start teaching in America really when I was into my 50s, and I was really sort of ready for it then. And it felt like well, it just felt like a really good thing to do. I was really happy to do it, and it was nice to have achieved, really quite late in life, a measure of financial security. So there's that. That was all nice, but more important than that, I think it's just so important when you get older to be to not become out of touch with what's happening in whatever your field is. So I'm very conscious that although I'm meant to be teaching, these young writers, I'm conscious that actually my relationship with them is much more vampiric than one might think. That I'm dependent on them for all sorts of literary recommendations, and all sorts of writers that I. If it wasn't for stuff that's been recommended to me by my students, I don't know, I'd probably still be reading just, I don't know, Anthony Powell or something. So in every way, it's been just an entirely positive thing for me, with no negative drawbacks. And I've certainly not suffered from that thing which can happen when you get some sort of institutional thing whereby you just do the teaching and enjoy the institutional security, but you give up on the writing, because actually I've just continued writing a great deal because there's been plenty that I've wanted to say still.
Who or what are some of the things that you've enjoyed as a result of your students' recommendations?
Oh yeah, for example, I can give a good example of that. I mean, when I was teaching at the Michener Center in Austin, Texas, they were all just crazy about this writer with the name that I couldn't even pronounce. So Tessa Mosfegh, I'd never heard of her, and they said, "Oh, she's great and she's such a badass," and all this sort of stuff. So of course, then I became rather resentful of this figure, and then I read her, and it turns out she was really, really great. So that would be one. And then, another example, there was one particular student of mine also at the Michener Center who was just obsessed with Joy Williams, who I'd never heard of. And he said, "You've got to read Joy Williams." And I did. And of course, I became an instant convert to Joy Williams with her I ended up reviewing her collected stories, the Visiting Privilege. So just lots of cases like that. I mean, and even quite apart from these individual recommendations, it's just so important in all aspects of one's life that you just never succumb to any kind of antiquarian idea that somehow all the great writing all the great writing was done before the 1930s or whatever it is.
Could we talk about your aircraft carrier book, which I really enjoyed? And I was wondering, reading it, whether you were influenced by or had read Tom Wolfe's aircraft carrier essay, which was, I think, published in Harper's. It was like the origin of what eventually became The Right Stuff, but at a much earlier time. And he, during the Vietnam War, I suppose, embedded, in modern parlance, with a aircraft carrier in the Gulf of Tonkin. And I was wondering whether that was a kind of influence or point of departure for you doing that at all.
Oh, how great to be able to say, well, Simon, if you'd read my aircraft carrier book thoroughly enough, you'll have noted that I actually quote from that Tom Wolfe essay,
Yeah,
Jousting with Whoever It Is.
yeah.
So how nice to have caught you out like that. I mean, yeah, I mean, so I became conscious of that essay. I can't remember how, while I was writing the book. And yeah, several things going on here. I mean, so I read it, and there's a big chunk, there's a really important chapter in the book about it, because as I read it, I remember thinking, oh shit, because the aircraft, a few technology, the planes are different now to the Phantoms that Tom Wolfe is writing about. But the experience is essentially unchanged, and he just captured it so well that I had one of those, oh my God, it's already been said moments, which are so fatal to writers. So yeah, my admiration for that book and the right stuff are total. And they're so great,
They're amazing, aren't
And
they?
then yeah, really great. And then going back to this phase that I was talking about when I was working at a publisher's office to be a reader. I mean, at the time, somebody this kind of foot-high box with the manuscript of Bonfire of the Vanities arrived, and somebody said, "There, could I give it a quick read through?" And at that point, for whatever reason, I'd not read Tom Wolfe, and in this way that the human mind can so easily go for stupid oppositions. Because I loved Hunter Thompson so much, I felt that meant I didn't like Tom Wolfe, who I hadn't read at that stage. So I said, "Oh, I don't want to read it. I don't like Tom Wolfe." Anyway, years later, I read The Right Stuff and realised Tom Wolfe was great. And only this year did I finally get round to reading Bonfire of the Vanities.
And what was your thought on his fiction?
It's absolutely great. It's so fantastic, and it's quite an interesting thing to read it now, because of course that was a really, really fashionable, of the moment, zeitgeisty book. But the fact that moment that version of New York has passed in a way, that makes the sort of test of Bonfire of the Vanities even more it makes the stakes higher. But oh yeah, its reputation as a classic is completely secured for me. So yeah, that was I'm absolutely he's absolutely great reporter and novelist up to that point. I haven't read any of the fiction that he wrote after Bonfire of the Vanities.
What made you want to write Another Great Day at Sea as a book rather than, say, a kind of long form article or an essay?
Oh yeah, well that was an unusual book in that it came about in the following way. I mean, my friend Alain de Botton had been a writer in residence at Heathrow Airport, and he'd had such a good time doing that, and he wrote a very short book about it, that he set up this, I suppose you'd call it a foundation, whereby he would get writers to be in residence at unusual places. Every college, most prisons now even have writers in residence. And he had this idea of getting people in residence at unusual places. And the trade-off of that is that you'd then write a short book about it. So he said, was there anywhere I'd like to go? And of course, I'm such a lowlife that my initial thought was, great, I'll go to the world's most expensive resort and sort of freeload there for as long as possible. But that didn't last for long, because as anyone knows who's ever written some sort of travel journalism, those are the places that are most difficult to write about. So I started to think more seriously about where it seemed to me there was only a point in doing this if you could get access to somewhere that you would never normally get to in your normal life. And there were two places I wanted to go. Obviously, the best place of all would be the International Space Station. That would be a real once-in-a-lifetime thing. But I mean, I didn't even mention that to Alain, because there was no way they could have swung that. And then very quickly after that, I realised it was something military. I wanted to go to a military place, which is by definition off limits to civilians. And it was a phase of my life when I was really reading a lot about the US Marine Corps. And I thought that would be I'd quite like to go to the place, where they train the Marines. And then the other thing I was interested in was, an American aircraft carrier. for because for all sorts.
And you specifically say you don't want it to be British, right? You have that line about it would be like the toff to prole. If you went for the British one, it would be the sort of toff to prole hierarchy. Was this definitely a kind of American? You wanted this to be an American aircraft carrier?
Yes, exactly. And of course, any military thing is very strictly hierarchical. So yeah, it's not going to be a sort of it's not going to be a health food shop collective necessarily, but just something about that the British class system is so naked in the military that. So I wanted that combination of a hierarchy, which I completely endorse in a military setting, but with that lovely sort of within the context of American democracy, if you like. And yeah, I just knew it would just too many hackles would be raised on a British one. And in any case, there's another thing. I mean, at that point, we didn't even have an aircraft carrier, whereas America's got thousands of them all floating around the world. So anyway, that's why I said if you could get me onto an aircraft carrier, that would be great. And then behind the scenes, all sorts of negotiations went on until out of the blue, I got a call saying, "Okay, that's it. You're on. When do you need to fly to Bahrain?" So I dutifully flew to Bahrain. And the deal was that, and I thought I was going to love it on the aircraft carrier because I've always liked, just always liked being in America. And then, sure enough, I really did have I did have a great time as I thought I would. And then at the end of this, the price to be paid was that I had to write my book, and it looked like being the most boring book I'd ever write because there was nothing to discover. In the course of writing the jazz book, I'd been able to discover what it was that was great about jazz. In the course of writing the First World War book, I found out what it was about the First World War that meant so much for me. Whereas with the aircraft carrier book, I'd had the experience. I knew what to make of the experience. It was great. And then all I had to do was like a court stenographer, sort of write it up. And initially it was a bit of a bore doing that, and there was no structural kind of excitement to be had. But then, as I started writing it, something strange happened, and I thought, I was so worried about not having enough to say that I kept writing, and I thought, well, I'll just keep writing, and then I can cut it down to the required 30,000 words. And then, of course, being, let's say, a fan of my own stuff, I found I'd written 60,000 words to which I'd become curiously attached. So I had simultaneously effectively halved my rate of pay per word, and the book sort of, whereas it was written as something, as a sort of commissioned thing, it kind of, it sort of grew out of that, and it became, I sort of felt, oh yeah, this has become... it's become a sort of proper book by me in its own right, even though its origins were so different to any of the others.
I think that's probably coming towards the end of our time. But Geoff, look, thank you for being such a stellar guest on Always Take Notes and for persisting with the technology, and wishing you with all the best with your other projects going forward.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Rachel. It's been a real pleasure. Yeah, it's been great.
Likewise.
Hello, it's us again. Simon, what did you make of our interview with Geoff?
I enjoyed it. Another one, obviously done remotely, which is something that we are getting better at, I think. And a big beast to have, a famous name and so forth. He was very gracious, and I think he was, again, someone who'd achieved a huge level of success and kind of portrayed it as a sort of effortless series of things that just happened to happen, which we've had a number of times, and I think we've discussed. I'm sometimes a little bit skeptical of that kind of presentation. But otherwise, it was, he's clearly, an extremely distinguished and very competent writer, and great to lift the lid on his process and his creative life.
Yeah, I agree. He pushed back a bit when I asked him about his career, the development of his career. But I really enjoyed talking to Geoff. I particularly enjoyed hearing about writing Another Great Day at Sea. Yeah,
he berated me mildly, I think, because I mentioned the Tom Wolfe piece from the 60s, which he then pointed out he had in fact name-checked in Another Great Day at Sea. But he did it very graciously. So it's great to have had him on the show. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer is Nicola Keane. Our social media is by Katie Lee. Our graphic design is by James Edgar. And our score is by Jess Danheiser.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, you can find us on Facebook at Always Take Notes, on Twitter at Take Notes Always, on Instagram at Always Take Notes, and on Patreon at Always Take Notes.
Many thanks. Goodbye.